Welcome back everybody to AQA A-Level History. This video is going to be talking about the events of the Reign of Terror, as well as the influence of Maximilien Robespierre, the influence of the sans-culottes, and the role of the CPS in the pushing of the Reign of Terror, the spread of the Reign of Terror. And then we will finish by focusing on the fall of Robespierre specifically, how the Reign of Terror essentially grows to a point at which it encapsulates himself, and then we see the collapse of the Terror and the ultimate collapse of this particular period of history. So that's what the specification essentially requires of us. We need to think about the spread of the terror, how the terror actually took place, the execution of the Reign of Terror, the influence of people like Robespierre and the group that we know to be the sans-culottes, and then we think about other different aspects of the Reign of Terror as well, the Committee of Public Safety, for example, and then we'll think about its collapse. So the spread of terror is the first part that I want to specify here and to speak about here with some kind of specificity. Now, we will begin by thinking about the establishment of the Revolutionary Tribunal and the use of the guillotine as a major method for the execution, should I say, pardon the pun, of the Reign of Terror. So the Revolutionary Tribunal was established in March 1793, so almost immediately after the execution of King Louis XVI. King Louis XVI, of course, was executed in January 1793, and facing the kinds of revolts that we start to see in various parts of the rural communities of France, the sort of counter-revolutionary movement, and also facing the growth and the spread of the wars against France, the revolutionary wars against France from places like Spain, the Dutch Republic, and also Great Britain, we see the Revolutionary Tribunal be established. It became the main body that was associated with the prosecution of those who were accused of being counter-revolutionary, or at least had been accused of engaging in counter-revolutionary activities, or being quote-unquote enemies of the revolution. The tribunal ultimately then was intended to dispense with swift justice in the face of the more urgent and established threats to the revolution itself. The tribunal was used extensively during the Reign of Terror itself, and the trials that were essentially being utilized and implemented by the Revolutionary Tribunal were notoriously quick, notoriously one-sided, with very little opportunity for any kind of defense. And with all this in mind, the symbol of the terror was the method of execution, and this is probably something that you would colloquially understood to be a sort of symbol of the French Revolution, which was, of course, the use of the guillotine, the method by which somebody becomes beheaded. Those convicted of being part of the counter-revolutionary activity or being enemies to the revolution were quickly convicted and swiftly, often publicly, executed by guillotine. Now, the victims of the terror by the end of 1793, thousands of people had been executed. Estimates suggest that between 16,000 and 40,000 people during the spread of the terror were executed during this particular period of time. Now, of course, depending on the source that you read and depending on the estimates that are included, will depend on the numbers that are cited. Victims of the terror included the enemies of the revolution. These were the most common targets, and they included the royalists, they included the nobles, they included religious figures, and anybody who was suspected of engaging with or facilitating counter-revolutionary activity. In addition to that, the moderates and former members of the revolutionary movements were also targeted during the Reign of Terror. So those, for example, who had initially supported the revolution, such as the Girondins, these were the moderate revolutionaries, or the Dantonists, people who were former allies of Robespierre, also would start to fall victim to the terror, as they were perceived as being far too moderate. Essentially, as this activity began to get even more radical and even more extreme, the people who would not go along with these more radical parts of the Reign of Terror would fall victim to the essential the essential end point at which people who would be victims of the terror would end up. They would end up being sent to the guillotine. And then finally, you have foreign enemies, people who were suspected to have been foreign spies, or anybody who was associated with the First Coalition, anybody who was seen as a member of the First Coalition, or at least sympathetic towards the coalition. Either Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, Dutch Republic, and others were also frequent targets of the Reign of Terror. So this is, you can see, a very, very important period of time in which basically everybody was seen as potentially a victim to become part of the Reign of Terror, and could have easily found themselves at the guillotine if they had not have been as radical as the Jacobins were in relation to the spread of the terror, the spread of the revolution. When it comes to Maximilien Robespierre, he was the head and one of the leading members of the Committee of Public Safety, the CPS, and he became one of the most powerful figures when it came to revolutionary France. We noted already that his beliefs in sort of virtue and terror were part of the essential elements in his belief in, should I say, preserving the revolution. He saw terror as a way to purge the nation of its enemies and to create a society based on virtue and moral purity. Famously, Robespierre stated that, quote, "Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible justice." So we can sort of see how he viewed anybody who was seen as not radical enough and not enough of a member of the revolution, who would then therefore receive the guillotine as a result of their perceived betrayal of the French state or the French Republic. He believed that in a time of war and revolution, such as they were in, the use of terror was a justified method to try and preserve liberty and to try and prevent the revolution from being overthrown. In addition to this, the working class urban revolutionaries, the group, the sort of loose association that were known as the sans-culottes, were fervently supportive of the terror as well. They played a very key role when it came to the pressuring of the revolutionary government to try and take more actions against their perceived, I'm using perceived in sort of inverted commas, enemies. They were particularly influential in the Commune of Paris and the National Convention. They demanded, for example, in the National Convention, stronger measures to ensure that the survival of the revolution would continue and that there would be the equality of the common people. There's a sort of certain sense of irony where we see the sort of equality of the common people in conjunction with the revolution and the Reign of Terror, often executing thousands of the common people. But ultimately, the sans-culottes would have supported Robespierre's government, viewing the terror as a means to enforce social justice and as a means to protecting revolutionary gains. In return, the Robespierre and Jacobins gave the sans-culottes a measure of influence over a number of the political decisions that were made in the national conventions. These were often decisions that would have favoured the lower classes within society. When we think about the Committee of Public Safety, it was formed in April 1793, and ultimately it was formed as a way to try and oversee the war effort and to try and ensure that there was a certain semblance of internal security. While it was initially a public body, it would eventually become dominated by the Jacobins, who had quite substantially uniform beliefs and understandings about the revolution. And so people like Georges Danton and Robespierre would become very, very dominant members of the CPS during this period. Ultimately, the CPS would be granted extraordinary powers, almost dictatorial powers and authority over the French Republic. This included the ability to take actions, essentially any actions, against the counter-revolutionaries and to oversee military and political decisions, as well as to control the revolutionary tribunals. In terms of how the CPS was utilized during the Reign of Terror, under the leadership of Robespierre, the CPS became the de facto executive government of France. It would ultimately begin to centralize authority and try to adopt extreme measures to root out what were perceived as the internal enemies, some of which were actually internal enemies, people like the counter-revolutionaries, others were just perceived to be internal enemies. The CPS would coordinate the Revolutionary Tribunal, it would coordinate the National Police, and it would oversee the arrest and execution of thousands of people during the terror itself. The law of suspects, for example, was passed in September 1793, and the law of suspects gave the CPS even broader powers. These were broader powers that were essentially allowing the CPS to arrest anybody deemed to be an enemy of the revolution. Anybody who was suspected of harboring not only counter-revolutionaries, but counter-revolutionary thoughts were seen as not sufficiently supportive of the revolution. They could be arrested, they could be tried, and they could be sent to the guillotine and executed. In addition to this, the committee also took charge of military operations when it came to the War of the First Coalition. They launched, for example, the Levée en masse, the conscription policy that we've spoken about in previous lessons. This was in August of 1793. We know already, for example, that they conscripted all unmarried men between 18 and 25 as part of the war effort to mobilize resources and to try and defend France against a foreign invasion. In terms of economic control, we've also spoken about these issues as well. The CPS sought to control the economy in order to maintain and to stabilize prices, as well as to maintain and stabilize the supply of goods. This included the September 1793 Law of the Maximum, which set price limits on essential goods such as foods and breads. Efforts to also requisition food and supplies from the countryside were also implemented as a way to try and fund and supply the army and the revolutionary government. These were policies that were fundamentally unpopular among the wealthy and those who were living in the rural areas of the French Republic. However, it should be noted that the CPS prioritized economic control as a means of trying to secure victory in both the foreign war against all of these European powers, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, etc., but also internal struggle and the attempts to try and quash any kind of internal struggle from the counter-revolutionary forces. But the Reign of Terror wasn't a particularly fun period of time, and it would ultimately lead to a point at which Robespierre himself becomes a target of these executions. And so the end of the Reign of Terror can be associated with the intensification of the violence. So between 1793, later on in 1793 and 1794, we can see that there is an intensification of the terror itself. The CPS became increasingly isolated. Many of the revolutionaries began to feel quite uneasy about the extreme measures that were being employed. We saw, for example, not only were other moderate members of the revolution executed in 1793, but then when we get to 1794, even the moderate Jacobins, like Georges Danton, for example, were executed as well. So we can see that essentially, as this extremism and as this radicalization continues and continues and continues, more and more people fall under the spell of the guillotine and fall into the trap of being part of the victims of the Reign of Terror. And eventually the terror itself will take everybody, and including Robespierre himself. The 1794 execution of the moderate Jacobins such as Danton demonstrated that the CPS had a significant growing paranoia about potential threats within their own ranks. All of these things would ultimately isolate Robespierre himself. His influence would continue to grow, which was a positive for him at least, as many former allies and members of the National Convention began to see him as a dictator and the increasing ideas of a dictator. Now remember, they overthrew the idea of absolutist monarchy in order to try and establish some kind of republic that was based on Enlightenment values. So the idea and the implication of Robespierre being considered a dictator, of course, went against the basic principles of the Enlightenment and the basic principles of the republic. And so when we think about Robespierre himself and his downfall, he increasingly advocated for a quite strong and sensitive type of rigid moralism, and his extreme measures would begin to alienate even more, even the most radical members of the revolutionary government. He became obsessed with the idea of the perfect republic, and he became completely uncompromising in his stance towards those who were enemies to the revolution. This again would alienate even more of his allies who had been key to the success itself. In July 1794, we see the Thermidorian reaction. This was on the 27th of July, specifically 1794. This is where a coalition of moderate revolutionaries and members of the National Convention, including members of Robespierre, former members of former allies, should I say, of Robespierre, decided to act against him specifically. They saw his authoritarian rule and the continuing terror as a threat to their own survival. Robespierre was then arrested after a failed attempt to deliver a speech in which he hinted at further purges. And so on the 28th of July 1794, the day later, Robespierre, along with a number of his closest associates, only those who were left to essentially associate with him, were executed by guillotine. This marked the point at which we see the collapse of the Reign of Terror. Robespierre's execution marked the end of this period. His fall was part of the larger Thermidorian reaction, in which we see political shift that led to the collapse of the radical Jacobin dictatorship. The aftermath of this particular period was that the Committee of Public Safety, the CPS, would lose its dominance, and its power would gradually be restored to the more moderate revolutionaries. These more moderate revolutionaries sought to stabilize France and to try and end the radical policies that had defined the terror itself. The guillotine still remained in use as a method of execution, but it would begin to drastically decline in the number of times it would be utilized. The guillotine would be used thousands of times to kill thousands of people during the Reign of Terror, but when we start to see the National Convention rolling back the harsh measures, the terror was replaced with a more moderate phase of the revolutionary politics. All of these things would eventually give rise to the imposition and the consolidation of power of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is something that we're going to start to think about when we think about the rise of Napoleon in the next chapter and in the next series of lessons, where we start to cover the period of French history between 1795 and 1799.